Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the military processing center, clutching her paperwork with sweaty palms. At 19 years old, she barely looked old enough to drive, let alone serve in the army. Her slight frame and nervous demeanor made her an easy target for the knowing glances of seasoned recruiters who had seen thousands of hopeful young people walk through these doors. "Another one who won't last a month," whispered Sergeant Martinez to his colleague as Sarah approached the desk. She heard the comment but pretended not to. This wasn't the first time someone had doubted her abilities, and she was certain it wouldn't be the last. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, Sarah had always been the quiet one. She wasn't the star athlete or the class president. She spent most of her time reading military history books and helping her grandmother tend to her garden. Her parents owned a small grocery store, and Sarah had worked there since she was 14, stocking shelves and running the register. She was reliable and hard-working, but nothing about her screamed soldier. The decision to join the Army had surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. It came during her senior year of high school when a military recruiter visited their small school. Staff Sergeant Johnson spoke about duty, honor, and making a difference in the world. While her classmates rolled their eyes or whispered jokes, Sarah found herself genuinely interested. That evening, she went home and announced to her shocked parents that she wanted to enlist. "But honey, you've never even been camping," her mother had said, worry creasing her face. "The military is so intense. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Her father was more direct. "Sarah, you can barely lift the water jugs at the store. How are you going to carry military equipment?" Their concerns weren't unfounded. Sarah had always struggled with physical activities. In high school PE class, she was always picked last for teams. She couldn't do a single pull-up and needed help opening tight jars. But something inside her had awakened that day in the school auditorium. For the first time in her life, she felt called to do something bigger than herself. The months between signing her papers and shipping out to basic training were filled with doubt from everyone around her. Her high school guidance counselor suggested community college instead. Her best friend Lisa couldn't understand why Sarah would want to leave their comfortable small-town life. Even Sarah's grandmother, who had always been her biggest supporter, expressed concern. "I'm proud of your courage, dear," her grandmother had said one evening as they watered the tomato plants together. "But courage and preparation are two different things. The military will test you in ways you can't imagine." Sarah had tried to prepare. She started running every morning before school, though she could barely make it around the block without stopping. She did push-ups in her bedroom, managing only 3 before her arms gave out. She read every military book she could find in the library, studying tactics, history, and survival techniques. But deep down, she wondered if everyone was right to doubt her. The day she left for basic training, half the town came to see her off. Some came to show support, others out of curiosity to see if she would actually go through with it. As the bus pulled away from the station, Sarah caught sight of her parents' worried faces and felt a knot form in her stomach. What if she really wasn't cut out for this? Basic training at Fort Benning was everything Sarah had feared and worse. The drill sergeant seemed to take special pleasure in calling attention to her struggles. While other recruits managed to keep up with morning runs, Sarah often found herself at the back of the group, gasping for air. Her small hands had trouble gripping the monkey bars, and her lack of upper body strength made rope climbing nearly impossible. "Chen, what are you doing back there? Taking a scenic tour?" Drill Sergeant Williams would shout as Sarah struggled through obstacle courses that other recruits completed with relative ease. The other recruits weren't particularly mean to Sarah, but they weren't helpful either. In the military, weakness could be dangerous, and nobody wanted to be associated with someone who might not have their back when it mattered. Sarah found herself eating alone more often than not, studying her field manuals while others socialized and formed bonds that would last throughout their service. The academic portions of training were where Sarah began to shine, though few people noticed. She scored highest in her class on map reading exercises and military protocol tests. Her attention to detail, honed from years of helping in her parents' store, made her excellent at equipment maintenance and inspection. But these quiet victories were overshadowed by her continued physical struggles. 3 weeks into basic training, Sarah seriously considered quitting. She lay in her bunk one night, listening to the quiet breathing of her fellow recruits, and wondered if everyone had been right about her. The next morning would bring another day of physical challenges that would likely end in embarrassment and frustration. She thought about how easy it would be to walk into the drill sergeant's office and request discharge. She could go home, attend community college like everyone had suggested, and forget this foolish dream of military service. But as she lay there, Sarah thought about her grandmother's garden. Every spring, they would plant seeds that looked impossibly small and fragile. Her grandmother would water them faithfully, even when it seemed like nothing was happening. "Plants grow in their own time," her grandmother would say. "Some bloom early and bright, others take longer to find their strength. But the late bloomers often have the deepest roots." The next morning, something had changed in Sarah. She still struggled with the physical demands, but she approached them differently. Instead of fighting against her limitations, she began working with them. She couldn't run fast, but she discovered she could run for a very long time without stopping. She couldn't do many push-ups quickly, but she could hold a plank position longer than anyone else in her platoon. Drill Sergeant Williams noticed the change, too. While Sarah was still often at the back of the group during runs, she was no longer falling behind or giving up. Her form during exercises improved steadily, and her determination became impossible to ignore. She still received criticism, but it was constructive rather than dismissive. "Chen, you're not strong yet, but you're getting stronger every day," he told her after a particularly challenging day of combat drills. "Strength isn't just about muscle. It's about not quitting when things get hard." The other recruits began to notice changes in Sarah as well. During a navigation exercise in the woods, several recruits became disoriented and panicked. Sarah calmly pulled out her compass and map, quickly calculating their position and leading the group back to the designated checkpoint. Word spread that the quiet girl who couldn't climb a rope had potentially saved their exercise evaluation. Later that week, during weapons training, Sarah's careful attention to detail caught an instructor's error that could have been dangerous. Her thorough understanding of safety protocols and equipment operation impressed the range master, who commended her publicly in front of the entire platoon. "This is why we have protocols, people," he announced. "Recruit Chen just prevented a potential accident by knowing her equipment and following proper procedures. Take notes." Slowly but surely, Sarah began earning respect. Not for being the fastest or strongest, but for being reliable, knowledgeable, and unshakable under pressure. When other recruits panicked during high-stress exercises, Sarah remained calm and focused. When equipment malfunctioned, she often knew how to fix it. When leadership rotated and recruits took turns leading formations, Sarah's commands were clear and precise, earned from studying leadership principles while others slept. The transformation wasn't just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. Sarah realized that strength came in many forms. Physical power was important, but mental toughness, emotional stability, and technical competence were equally valuable on a battlefield. She would never be the biggest or fastest soldier, but she could be the most prepared and reliable. As basic training neared its end, Sarah had climbed from the bottom of her class rankings to somewhere solidly in the middle. More importantly, she had gained the respect of her drill sergeants and fellow recruits. The girl who had arrived looking like she might wash out in the first week was now someone others looked to for guidance during complex exercises. The night before graduation, Drill Sergeant Williams pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Chen, when you first arrived here, I didn't think you'd make it past week 2, he admitted. You looked like a strong breeze might knock you over. But you've shown me something I don't see often enough in new soldiers. What's that, drill sergeant? Real grit. Not the kind that shows off or makes noise, but the quiet kind that just keeps going no matter what. The Army needs soldiers like that, especially where you're headed next. Sarah was being assigned to an infantry support unit that would likely deploy overseas within the year. It was exactly what she had hoped for when she enlisted, a chance to serve in a meaningful way and make a real difference. But as graduation day arrived, Sarah knew her journey was just beginning. Standing in formation with her fellow graduates, Sarah thought about how far she had come from that nervous teenager clutching paperwork at the processing center. She was still small in stature, still quiet by nature, but something fundamental had changed. She had discovered that appearances could be deceiving, including her own appearance to herself. Her parents attended the graduation ceremony, their faces beaming with pride and surprise. They had come expecting to see their daughter struggle through another challenge, but instead watched her march in perfect formation with a confidence they had never seen before. "I hardly recognize her," her mother whispered to her father as Sarah passed by during the parade review. "She looks like a real soldier," her father replied, amazement clear in his voice. After the ceremony, Sarah's grandmother approached her, having made the long trip despite her arthritis. "I told you plants grow in their own time," she said with a knowing smile, embracing her granddaughter. "I always knew you had deep roots. Now the world is going to find out too." As Sarah prepared for her first duty assignment, she reflected on the lesson that basic training had taught her. Success wasn't about being the biggest, fastest, or loudest. It was about persistence, preparation, and the courage to keep growing even when others doubted your potential. She had looked like a newbie when she arrived, and in many ways she still was. But she was a newbie with heart, determination, and an unshakable belief that she belonged in uniform. The real test, however, was still to come. Basic training had taught her to be a soldier, but combat would teach her what kind of soldier she really was. Sarah Chen had no way of knowing that within 2 years, she would face challenges that would test every lesson she had learned and push her far beyond anything she thought possible. For now, though, she was simply proud to have proven wrong everyone who thought she wouldn't make it through basic training. As she packed her gear for her first real assignment, Sarah smiled at the memory of Sergeant Martinez's whispered comment on her first day. "Another one who won't last a month?" She had not only lasted, but thrived. And this was just the beginning of her story. 18 months after graduation, Specialist Sarah Chen found herself stepping off a military transport plane into the scorching heat of Forward Operating Base Courage in Afghanistan. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty airstrip, and the thin mountain air made every breath feel insufficient. Around her, seasoned soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, unloading equipment and greeting returning comrades with casual familiarity. Sarah shouldered her heavy pack and followed the stream of new arrivals toward the processing tent. Despite completing advanced infantry training and serving stateside for over a year, she still felt like an outsider looking in. The veteran soldiers around her moved with a confidence that came from experience she didn't yet possess. "Fresh meat," she heard someone mutter as she passed by a group of soldiers who looked like they had been in country for months. Their uniforms were faded from sun and dust, their faces weathered by constant exposure to harsh conditions. They looked at the new arrivals with a mixture of pity and amusement, remembering their own first days in theater. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah's new squad leader, was waiting in the processing area with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he had done this briefing many times before. "Listen up, new people," he announced to the group of about 20 soldiers. "I know you all completed your training and think you know what to expect, but nothing really prepares you for this place. Keep your heads down, follow orders exactly, and maybe you'll make it home in one piece." His eyes swept over the group, pausing briefly on Sarah. She could see him cataloging her small stature and young face. probably wondering how someone who looked barely old enough to vote had ended up in a combat zone. "Chen," he called out, consulting his roster. "You're assigned to 3rd Squad. Your team leader is Sergeant Jackson. He's been here 8 months and knows how to keep people alive. I suggest you listen to everything he tells you." Sarah's first few weeks at FOB Courage were a continuation of the pattern that had defined much of her military experience so far. She performed her duties competently, studied operational procedures in her spare time, and tried to prove herself worthy of her fellow soldiers' trust. But combat operations were different from training exercises, and everyone knew it. The base itself was a sprawling collection of prefabricated buildings, concrete barriers, and guard towers surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire. Beyond those walls lay a landscape of mountains, valleys, and villages where insurgent activity made every mission dangerous and unpredictable. Sarah spent her first week pulling guard duty, manning checkpoints, and learning the base's defensive positions. Sergeant Jackson was a tall, serious man from Tennessee who had been in the Army for 6 years. He had a reputation for bringing his soldiers home safely, but he also had little patience for weakness or hesitation. "Chen, you seem like you pay attention to details," he told her after observing her meticulous equipment checks one morning. "That's good. Attention to detail keeps people alive out here. But paying attention won't mean much if you freeze up when things get real." "I won't freeze up, Sergeant," Sarah replied, though she wondered if she was making a promise she could keep. "We'll see," Jackson said with a slight nod. "Everyone says that until bullets start flying. The only way to really know is to be there." Sarah's first mission outside the wire came 3 weeks after her arrival. 3rd Squad was assigned to provide security for an engineering team repairing a damaged bridge in a village about 15 kilometers from the base. It was considered a relatively low-risk mission, which made it perfect for breaking in new soldiers. As their convoy of armored vehicles rolled through the base gates, Sarah felt her heart racing. She gripped her rifle tightly and tried to remember everything she had learned in training about convoy operations, vehicle positioning, and threat assessment. The landscape outside was beautiful in a harsh way. Jagged mountains rising against a brilliant blue sky, with small farming communities scattered throughout the valleys below. "Stay alert, but don't look nervous," advised Corporal Williams, a veteran soldier riding across from Sarah in the vehicle. "The locals can sense fear, and nervous soldiers make bad decisions." The mission proceeded smoothly for the first several hours. The engineering team worked efficiently to repair the bridge, while 3rd Squad established a security perimeter around the worksite. Sarah was positioned on the north side of the bridge, watching a dirt road that wound between 2 hills. She observed farmers working their fields, children playing near a small mosque, and elderly men sitting in the shade discussing local affairs. It was almost peaceful, which made what happened next even more shocking. The explosion came without warning. A roadside bomb hidden beneath a pile of debris detonated as a local vehicle passed over it, sending metal and rock flying in all directions. Sarah felt the shockwave knock her backward just as she heard Sergeant Jackson shouting orders over the radio. "IED! IED! All positions stay alert for secondary attacks." Before Sarah could fully process what was happening, the sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from the hills to the east. Bullets struck the ground around her position, sending up small clouds of dust and forcing her to take cover behind a concrete barrier. "Contact east! Contact east!" someone was shouting into the radio. Sarah's training kicked in before her conscious mind had time to panic. She identified the direction of incoming fire, located covered positions for herself and her team members, and began returning fire with controlled, aimed shots. The rifle felt familiar in her hands despite the chaos around her, and she found herself moving and communicating with surprising clarity. "Chen, can you see muzzle flashes from the hillside?" Sergeant Jackson called out from his position about 30 meters away. Sarah scanned the rocky slope systematically, using the techniques she had practiced hundreds of times in training. There, a brief flash of light from behind a large boulder about 400 meters up the slope. "I see one position behind the large boulder cluster, approximately 400 meters northeast," she responded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Good. Lay down suppressive fire on that position while Williams flanks left." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah found herself fully engaged in her first real firefight. She moved between covered positions, communicated target information, and provided accurate suppressive fire that allowed her team members to maneuver safely. When the enemy fire finally stopped and the immediate threat was neutralized, she realized that she had performed exactly as her training had prepared her to do. "Not bad for your first contact," Sergeant Jackson told her as they secured the area and called in medical evacuation for 2 engineers who had been injured by the initial explosion. "You kept your head and did your job. That's all anyone can ask for." But Sarah barely heard the praise. She was focused on the 2 wounded engineers, both of whom were bleeding heavily and appeared to be in shock. Without thinking, she moved to assist the medic who was working frantically to stabilize the more seriously injured man. "I need pressure on this wound," the medic called out as he worked to stop arterial bleeding from the engineer's leg. Sarah pressed down firmly on the indicated location, ignoring the blood that immediately soaked through her gloves. She held the pressure while the medic worked to establish an IV line and prepare the casualty for transport. "Good pressure. Keep it steady," the medic instructed as he prepared emergency medications. "This guy's going to make it thanks to quick action." As the medical evacuation helicopter arrived and the wounded soldiers were loaded aboard, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed inside her. The nervous girl, who had stepped off the transport plane 3 weeks earlier, was gone. In her place was a soldier who had faced combat and responded with competence and courage. The missions that followed became increasingly complex and dangerous. Sarah's squad was assigned to patrol routes known for insurgent activity, to provide security for supply convoys traveling through hostile areas, and to participate in raids designed to capture high-value targets. Each mission brought new challenges and opportunities for Sarah to prove her worth to her fellow soldiers. 2 months into her deployment, Sarah's convoy was ambushed while returning from a mission to deliver medical supplies to a remote village. The attack was more sophisticated than previous encounters, with insurgents using multiple firing positions and coordinated tactics to pin down the American force. Sarah's vehicle was struck by a rocket-propelled grenade that disabled the engine and wounded the driver. Despite ringing in her ears from the explosion and sharp pain in her right arm where shrapnel had penetrated her body armor, Sarah immediately began providing first aid to the driver while also returning fire at the attacking force. "Chen, can you move?" Sergeant Jackson called over the radio. "Affirmative, Sergeant. Driver needs medical attention, but the wound isn't critical. We can hold this position." For the next hour, Sarah fought from her disabled vehicle while coordinating with the rest of her squad to repel the attack. Blood from her shrapnel wound soaked through her sleeve, but she maintained her position and continued engaging targets until air support arrived and scattered the attacking force. Later, at the base medical facility, the doctor examining Sarah's wounds was impressed by her steady hands and clear thinking despite her injury. "Most soldiers are pretty shaken up after their first Purple Heart," he commented as he cleaned and stitched the shrapnel wounds. "You seem remarkably calm for someone who just got blown up." "First Purple Heart?" Sarah asked, surprised. "These shrapnel wounds qualify you for the Purple Heart," the doctor explained. "You were wounded by enemy action while engaged in combat operations." "That's exactly what the award recognizes." Sarah had never really thought about military awards or decorations. She had enlisted to serve her country and make a difference, not to collect medals. But as she reflected on the medal that would soon be pinned to her uniform, she realized it represented something important: proof that she belonged in combat alongside her fellow soldiers. Word of Sarah's performance during the ambush spread quickly throughout the base. Soldiers who had initially dismissed her as too small or inexperienced began seeking her out for conversation and including her in the informal social groups that formed the backbone of military unit cohesion. "You know, Chen," Corporal Williams told her one evening as they cleaned weapons together, "when you first showed up, I figured you'd be on the first bird home within a month. But you've got something that can't be taught. You don't panic under pressure, and you always do what needs to be done." The respect Sarah had earned through her actions began opening doors to additional responsibilities. Sergeant Jackson started including her in mission planning sessions, valuing her analytical approach and attention to detail. When the squad's communications specialist was injured and evacuated, Sarah volunteered to take over radio duties in addition to her regular assignments. "Chen knows the equipment and procedures better than anyone," Jackson explained to the platoon leader when recommending Sarah for the additional responsibility. "She's reliable under pressure, and the other soldiers trust her." 3 months later, Sarah found herself in a leadership role when Sergeant Jackson was promoted and transferred to another unit. Despite being one of the most junior soldiers in the squad, her combat experience and proven reliability made her the logical choice to serve as acting squad leader until a replacement could be assigned. "I know this is unusual," Lieutenant Morrison explained to Sarah when offering her the temporary leadership position, "but the men respect you, and you've demonstrated the kind of judgment we need in leaders. Are you ready for the responsibility?" Sarah accepted the challenge with characteristic determination. Leading other soldiers was different from following orders, but she approached it with the same methodical preparation that had served her well in previous situations. She studied leadership manuals, observed successful leaders throughout the base, and worked closely with experienced sergeants who could provide guidance and mentorship. Her first major test as a leader came during a complex mission to clear a suspected insurgent compound in a mountainous area near the Pakistani border. Intelligence reports suggested the compound contained weapons caches and possibly high-value targets, but the terrain made it difficult to approach without being detected. Sarah spent hours studying satellite imagery, topographical maps, and intelligence reports to develop an approach that would minimize risk to her soldiers while maximizing their chances of success. She coordinated with air support elements, planned multiple contingency scenarios, and briefed each team member thoroughly on their individual responsibilities. The mission went exactly as planned until her squad encountered an improvised explosive device that had been carefully concealed along their planned route. The explosion wounded 2 soldiers and left Sarah's team pinned down in an exposed position with enemy fighters closing in from multiple directions. Despite the chaos and danger, Sarah remained calm and began implementing the contingency plans she had developed. She called for medical evacuation, coordinated defensive positions, and directed supporting fires that kept the enemy at bay until reinforcements could arrive. During the firefight, Sarah was struck by small arms fire that penetrated her body armor and lodged in her shoulder blade. The impact knocked her down and caused significant pain, but she continued leading her squad's defense until the threat was neutralized. Her second Purple Heart was awarded along with a Bronze Star for her leadership during the engagement. But what mattered most to Sarah was that all her soldiers made it home safely, despite the complex and dangerous situation they had faced. As her deployment neared its end, Sarah reflected on how much she had changed since arriving at HFY Courage. The uncertain young soldier who had worried about freezing under pressure had become a proven combat leader whose judgment was trusted by subordinates and superiors alike. She had earned respect, not through dramatic gestures or heroic speeches, but through consistent competence and unwavering dedication to her fellow soldiers. The girl who had once looked like a newbie had become exactly what the Army needed: a quiet professional who could be counted on when things got difficult. Sergeant First Class Sarah Chen stepped off the transport plane for her 3rd deployment, this time to a volatile region of Iraq where sectarian violence and insurgent activity had created one of the most dangerous operational environments in the theater. 6 years had passed since she first nervously clutched her enlistment papers, and the transformation was complete in every way except one. She still looked remarkably young. At 25, Sarah commanded respect from soldiers twice her age, who had heard stories about the quiet logistics specialist who had evolved into one of the Army's most reliable non-commissioned officers. Her uniform now displayed the ribbons and badges of an experienced combat veteran, but her youthful appearance still occasionally surprised people meeting her for the first time. "Sergeant Chen?" asked Major Patterson, the battalion operations officer, when Sarah reported to headquarters for her initial briefing. He looked up from his paperwork with barely concealed surprise. "I was expecting someone older." "Yes, sir, that happens a lot," Sarah replied with a slight smile. She had learned to address such reactions with humor rather than defensiveness. "I get that reaction from everyone until they see my service record." Major Patterson quickly reviewed her file, his expression changing as he read through combat reports, commendation letters, and efficiency ratings that painted the picture of an exceptional soldier. 2 Purple Hearts, Bronze Star with V device, multiple commendations for leadership under fire, he read aloud. "I apologize for my assumption, Sergeant. We're lucky to have you here." Sarah was assigned to lead a combined logistics and security team responsible for maintaining supply lines through some of the most contested territory in the region. Her mission was to ensure that forward operating bases received critical supplies while minimizing casualties among both military personnel and Iraqi civilians caught in the crossfire of ongoing violence. The challenges were unlike anything she had faced in her previous deployments. Roadside bombs had become more sophisticated and deadly. Insurgent tactics had evolved to include complex coordinated attacks designed to maximize casualties among coalition forces. Local populations were caught between competing factions, making it difficult to distinguish between friendly civilians and potential threats. "The situation here is more fluid than Afghanistan," explained Captain Torres, Sarah's company commander, during her first operational briefing. "Yesterday's ally might be today's enemy, and the rules of engagement change based on local political developments that we don't always understand." Sarah approached these new challenges with the same methodical preparation that had served her throughout her career. She studied regional politics, learned basic Arabic phrases, and worked closely with Iraqi translators to better understand the cultural dynamics that influenced daily operations. Most importantly, she focused on training her soldiers to think critically about every situation rather than simply following predetermined procedures. "Every mission is different here," she explained to her team during their first training session together. "We need to be ready to adapt quickly when situations change. That means staying alert, communicating constantly, and thinking 3 steps ahead of whatever we're facing." Her team consisted of 12 soldiers with varying levels of experience, from fresh graduates of basic training to seasoned veterans with multiple deployments. The diversity of experience levels created both opportunities and challenges for Sarah as a leader. Private First Class Martinez had arrived straight from advanced individual training and looked even younger than Sarah had during her first deployment. His nervous energy and eagerness to prove himself reminded Sarah of her own early days in the military. "Relax, Martinez," Sarah told him during convoy preparation one morning. "Nervous energy makes everyone else nervous too. Focus on your job and trust your training. Everything else will take care of itself." Staff Sergeant Thompson, on the other hand, was a 15-year veteran with 4 previous deployments who had initially questioned serving under such a young squad leader. His skepticism had faded quickly once he observed Sarah's competence and leadership style, but the dynamic required careful management. "Sergeant Chen knows her business," Thompson told the other experienced soldiers in the squad. "I've seen plenty of leaders who talked a good game but couldn't deliver when it mattered." "She's not one of those," Sarah's first major test in Iraq came during a routine supply convoy that was ambushed in a coordinated attack involving improvised explosive devices, small arms fire, and rocket-propelled grenades. The sophistication of the attack suggested significant planning and intelligence gathering by the opposing force. The lead vehicle in Sarah's convoy was disabled by a massive IED that had been buried beneath the roadway for what appeared to be several weeks. The explosion killed the driver instantly and severely wounded 2 other soldiers. Immediately afterward, insurgent fighters opened fire from concealed positions on both sides of the road. Sarah's vehicle was third in the convoy formation, giving her a clear view of the developing situation and positioning her to coordinate the response. Despite the chaos and immediate danger, she began implementing emergency procedures with practiced efficiency. All stations, this is 6. We have IED strike on lead vehicle with multiple casualties, establishing defensive perimeter and calling for medical evacuation, she radioed to her dispersed team members. The firefight that followed lasted nearly 3 hours and involved some of the most intense combat Sarah had ever experienced. Insurgent fighters attempted to overrun the American position multiple times, using coordinated movements and suppressive fire to advance on the disabled convoy. During the engagement, Sarah was struck by mortar fragments that penetrated her helmet and caused significant head wounds. Blood flowing into her eyes made it difficult to see clearly. But she continued directing the defense and coordinating with supporting elements until reinforcements arrived. "Sergeant, you need medical attention," Corporal Rodriguez called out when he saw Sarah's condition. "Not until everyone else is secure," Sarah replied, wiping blood from her face with a bandana while continuing to observe enemy positions through her scope. Her 3rd Purple Heart was awarded along with her 2nd Bronze Star, but Sarah was more concerned with the 3 soldiers from her convoy who had been killed in the attack. She spent the following weeks reviewing every detail of the mission, looking for lessons that could prevent similar losses in future operations. The incident demonstrated once again that Sarah's greatest strength as a leader was her ability to remain focused and analytical even under extreme pressure. While other soldiers might be overwhelmed by the emotional trauma of losing comrades, Sarah channeled her grief into determination to become a better leader and protector of her remaining soldiers. "Some people fall apart when bad things happen," observed Chaplain Williams during one of the counseling sessions that Sarah attended after the convoy attack. "Others get stronger. You seem to be in the 2nd category, but don't forget to grieve when you need to." As her 2nd deployment in Iraq continued, Sarah found herself increasingly involved in complex operations that required coordination between multiple units and agencies. Her reputation for reliability and sound judgment had spread throughout the brigade, leading to assignments that were typically reserved for much more senior leaders. One such mission involved establishing a temporary forward operating base in a contested city where intelligence indicated the presence of high-value targets. Sarah was tasked with securing the logistical infrastructure needed to support a week-long operation involving Special Operations Forces, regular infantry units, and Iraqi Army partners. The mission required Sarah to coordinate transportation, security, communications, and medical support for nearly 200 soldiers operating in an environment where the threat situation changed hourly. Her attention to detail and ability to anticipate problems before they developed proved crucial to the operation's success. On the 4th day of the operation, Sarah's forward command post was struck by a coordinated mortar attack that had been precisely targeted based on electronic surveillance of American communications. The attack killed 2 soldiers and wounded 6 others, including Sarah, who suffered severe injuries to her left arm and shoulder when a mortar round detonated less than 10 meters from her position. Despite her injuries, Sarah continued coordinating the evacuation of wounded personnel and the defense of the command post until she lost consciousness from blood loss. When she awoke in the medical facility 12 hours later, the first thing she asked about was the status of her soldiers. "Your people are fine, Sergeant," the doctor assured her. They completed the mission successfully, thanks in large part to the preparations you made before the attack. Her fourth Purple Heart was accompanied by a recommendation for the Silver Star, though Sarah was more focused on recovering quickly enough to rejoin her unit before their deployment ended. The wounds to her arm required multiple surgeries and extensive physical therapy, but her determination to return to duty motivated a recovery that impressed her medical team. "I've never seen anyone work so hard to get back to a combat zone," commented the physical therapist who supervised Sarah's rehabilitation. "Most people would be grateful for a medical evacuation home." "My soldiers are still over there," Sarah explained simply. "They're my responsibility." Sarah did return to Iraq for the final month of her unit's deployment, though in a limited duty status that prevented her from participating in combat operations. She spent the time training replacement leaders, documenting lessons learned, and ensuring smooth transition of responsibilities to the incoming unit. The experience of being wounded and temporarily removed from combat gave Sarah new perspective on leadership and sacrifice. She had always understood intellectually that military service involved personal risk, but experiencing serious injury made the reality more immediate and personal. When her unit returned to their home station, Sarah was promoted to Sergeant First Class and assigned to train new non-commissioned officers. Her combat experience and proven leadership abilities made her an ideal instructor for soldiers preparing for their own deployments. For 2 years, Sarah devoted herself to training the next generation of military leaders. She taught courses on small unit tactics, leadership under pressure, and the ethical responsibilities of non-commissioned officers. Her students consistently rated her among the most effective instructors they had encountered, praising her practical experience and ability to make complex concepts understandable. But Sarah felt increasingly restless in a training environment. She had found her calling in combat leadership, and the relative safety of a garrison assignment felt somehow insufficient after years of high-stakes operations overseas. When the opportunity arose for another deployment, this time as a platoon sergeant responsible for 30 soldiers, Sarah volunteered immediately, despite the concerns of friends and family who felt she had already done enough. "You've been wounded 4 times, her mother pointed out during a phone conversation. "How many times do you need to risk your life before you've done your duty?" "Mom, there are young soldiers over there who need experienced leaders," Sarah replied. "If I don't go, someone less prepared might have to fill that role. I can't live with that thought." Sarah's 4th deployment took her to a remote region of Afghanistan, where coalition forces were working to transition security responsibilities to Afghan military units. Her role involved training Afghan soldiers while also conducting combat operations against Taliban forces that remained active in the area. The mission combined all the skills Sarah had developed over her previous deployments: tactical expertise, cultural sensitivity, language ability, and the judgment needed to work effectively with local partners whose motivations and capabilities varied widely. Sarah's platoon was assigned to a small outpost that provided security for a rural district where local government officials were attempting to establish basic services for the civilian population. The work was challenging and dangerous, requiring constant vigilance against insurgent attacks while also building relationships with Afghan partners. 3 months into the deployment, Sarah's outpost was targeted in a massive attack involving nearly 50 Taliban fighters who had infiltrated the area over several weeks. The attack began before dawn with coordinated mortar and rocket fire, followed by ground assault from multiple directions. The battle lasted 8 hours and tested every aspect of Sarah's leadership abilities. She coordinated defensive fires, managed ammunition resupply, directed medical evacuation of wounded soldiers, and maintained communication with supporting elements while also engaging targets with her personal weapon. During the heaviest fighting, Sarah was struck by small arms fire that penetrated her body armor and caused internal injuries. Despite severe pain and difficulty breathing, she continued leading the defense until the attack was finally repelled. "Sergeant, you're hit bad," called out Specialist Johnson, who had been fighting from a position near Sarah's command post. "How bad?" Sarah asked, though she could taste blood in her mouth and was beginning to feel weak. "Bad enough that you need to get to the aid station now," Johnson replied urgently. This time, Sarah allowed herself to be evacuated immediately rather than waiting until all other casualties had been treated. Her 5th Purple Heart was earned through injuries severe enough to require immediate medical evacuation to a trauma center in Germany, followed by additional treatment at Walter Reed Medical Center in the United States. The recovery process was longer and more difficult than her previous injuries. Internal bleeding had been stopped through emergency surgery, but the damage to her internal organs required months of medical treatment and rehabilitation. For the first time since enlisting, Sarah faced the possibility that her injuries might end her military career. "The good news is that you're going to make a full recovery," her doctor explained during one of their regular consultations. "The bad news is that it's going to take time, and you may need to consider whether continued combat service is advisable." As Sarah worked through her physical rehabilitation, she also grappled with questions about her future that she had never seriously considered. She had devoted 8 years to military service and had proven herself as both a soldier and a leader. But she was still only 27 years old, and the prospect of decades of civilian life felt strange and unfamiliar. The decision was ultimately made for her when medical evaluators determined that her injuries, while fully healed, created increased risk for certain types of future combat assignments. Sarah was offered the opportunity to continue serving in non-combat roles, but after careful consideration, she chose to transition to civilian life. Her retirement ceremony was attended by soldiers from throughout her career, many of whom credited Sarah with teaching them lessons that had kept them alive in combat. General Morrison, who had commanded the brigade during Sarah's 2nd Iraq deployment, delivered remarks that summarized her career more eloquently than any official record. "Sergeant First Class Chen represents everything we value in a non-commissioned officer," he told the assembled audience. "She has demonstrated courage under fire, devotion to duty, and selfless service to her fellow soldiers. But most importantly, she has shown that true leadership comes not from rank or position, but from character and competence." After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by Major Patterson, the operations officer who had been surprised by her youthful appearance years earlier. "You know, Sergeant, you still look like you're barely old enough to vote," he said with a smile. "But I've never met anyone who proved so thoroughly that appearances can be deceiving." Sarah's transition to civilian life was made easier by the network of veterans who had served with her over the years. She used her military education benefits to complete a college degree and eventually found work with a defense contractor that provided training services to military units. Her job allowed her to continue serving soldiers indirectly while also building a new life outside the military. She married another veteran she had met during rehabilitation, and together they worked to help other transitioning service members find their place in civilian society. But Sarah's most meaningful contribution came through her work as a mentor to young women considering military service. She regularly spoke at high schools and colleges, sharing her story of transformation from an uncertain teenager to a decorated combat veteran. "When I first enlisted, everyone doubted whether I had what it takes to be a soldier," she would tell audiences of young people, "including me. But I learned that strength comes in many forms and that determination and preparation can overcome almost any obstacle." Sarah's story became particularly meaningful to young women who faced similar doubts about their ability to succeed in military service. She encouraged them to focus on their own potential rather than other people's expectations, and to remember that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite being afraid. "I looked like a newbie when I started, and in many ways I was," Sarah would conclude her presentations. But looking like a newbie doesn't mean you can't become a professional. Every expert was once a beginner who refused to quit. The 5 Purple Hearts displayed in Sarah's home office served as reminders of the price she had paid for her service, but they also represented proof of her resilience and dedication. She had transformed herself from a nervous teenager who could barely complete basic training into a seasoned leader who had earned the respect of some of the military's finest soldiers. More importantly, Sarah had learned that true strength was not about being the biggest, fastest, or loudest person in the room. It was about being reliable when others were counting on you, staying calm when situations became chaotic, and never giving up when things got difficult. Years later, when young soldiers asked Sarah for advice about succeeding in the military, she always gave them the same answer her grandmother had given her about growing plants. Everyone grows at their own pace. Some bloom early and bright, others take longer to find their strength. But the late bloomers often have the deepest roots. Sarah Chen had certainly been a late bloomer, but her roots had grown deep enough to support not only her own success, but also the success of countless other soldiers who benefited from her leadership, mentorship, and example. She had looked like a newbie until she secured 5 Purple Hearts, but in the process, she had become something much more valuable, a true professional who inspired others to discover their own hidden strength.